Eli Turner had worked in the Grand Westbrook Symphony Hall for almost 10 years. He was the man nobody noticed, the quiet janitor who came in before dawn, cleaned the aisles, polished the seats, and left after everyone else had gone home. While the musicians tuned their instruments and the conductor shouted directions, Eli moved quietly in the background with his mop and bucket. No one ever asked his name. They only called him "Hey, Janitor." That morning, the air in the concert hall was filled with music. Violins cried, trumpets blared, and the great chandelier shimmered under the golden lights. Eli worked near the stage, sweeping, humming softly to himself. The melody he hummed wasn't random. It was from a classical piece he had once played long ago. But no one in the hall knew that. They only saw a man in overalls, hands rough, face tired. The new conductor, Maestro Alden, was a proud man with silver hair and sharp eyes. He loved being the center of attention. During rehearsals, he shouted at musicians, waved his baton like a sword, and demanded perfection. Everyone feared him. When he heard Eli humming behind the stage, he turned suddenly, his face twisting with annoyance. "Who dares interrupt my orchestra?" Alden barked, his voice echoed off the marble walls. The musicians froze, turning toward the janitor standing near the piano with his broom. Eli stopped humming, his eyes lowered. "I'm sorry, sir, I didn't mean," he began. But Alden cut him off. "You didn't mean." The conductor mocked. "Do you know what this is? This is art. This is music, not some street tune for a cleaner to hum." The orchestra laughed quietly, some hiding their smiles behind their instruments. Eli felt his cheeks burn. He wanted to disappear. "I'm sorry, sir," Eli said again softly. "I'll be quiet." But Alden wasn't finished. He walked toward Eli, his polished shoes clicking on the wooden floor. "Quiet? You think that's enough? You're just a janitor, not a musician. Leave the music to those who understand it," he said with a smirk. The words hit Eli harder than any insult he'd heard before, because once long ago, he had been one of those who understand. The musicians chuckled. Alden raised his hand dramatically. "Now, everyone, let's return to what we're here for. Real music," he said loudly, making sure Eli heard every word. The laughter faded as the conductor began again. But Eli stood there for a moment, frozen, holding his broom like it was a walking stick. He turned slowly and walked backstage. Each step felt heavier than the last in the dim hallway. He stopped beside a door labeled "Storage Room." He leaned against it and closed his eyes. The sound of violins drifted through the walls, sweet and cold, like a memory he could never touch again. Inside his chest, something stirred, a mixture of sadness and anger. He remembered the feel of piano keys under his fingers, the way music used to flow through him like air. He remembered applause, spotlights, and his wife smiling from the front row. But that was another life, one that ended years ago later that day. When rehearsal ended and the hall emptied, Eli came back to finish his cleaning. He pushed his mop across the silent floor. His reflection shimmered faintly on the polished wood, and he paused near the grand piano, the same instrument he had once played before thousands of people. He looked around. No one was there. The chandeliers were dim. Only the moonlight spilled through the tall windows. He ran a hand along the piano's smooth surface. The dust tickled his fingers. He sat down slowly on the bench. It creaked under his weight. His hands hovered over the keys, shaking. He hadn't played in years. Then softly he pressed one key. The sound echoed gently. Pure and perfect, he smiled a little, then played another note and another, until a quiet melody filled the hall. It was the same tune he had hummed earlier, but now it sounded alive, beautiful, the kind of music that came not from pride but from pain. Eli closed his eyes and let his fingers move. The notes flowed like memories. Some of them hurt, some of them healed. For a moment, he wasn't a janitor anymore. He was a man who could speak without words, tell stories through sound, and bring emotions to life. What Eli didn't notice was that someone had stopped by the doorway. A young violinist, Clara, had returned to pick up her forgotten scarf. She stood silently watching him play. Her eyes widened as she realized this wasn't just a janitor tapping keys. This was a master. Eli finished the piece, the final note fading into the night. He sighed, stood up, and went back to his cleaning. Unaware that his secret had been seen, Clara slowly took out her phone, her hands trembling, and pressed record. By the next morning, everyone would know that the man they laughed at wasn't just a janitor. He was someone extraordinary, someone whose music could silence a room. But for now, in that quiet moonlit hall, Only Eli and the piano knew the truth, and that was enough. That night, Eli walked home under the soft rain. His old brown jacket was soaked, but he didn't care. The city lights shimmered on the wet pavement, and his mind replayed the sound of the piano keys. Every note he had played echoed inside him, stirring feelings he thought were buried forever. His small apartment sat on the edge of town, tucked between a bakery and a closed-down bookstore. When he stepped inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and old wood. The walls were lined with shelves filled with faded sheet music, yellowed newspaper clippings and black and white photos of a young man at a grand piano, smiling confidently beside a woman with soft eyes. That young man had been Eli Turner, long before the world forgot his name. Before life broke him into silence, he hung his jacket on a hook and switched on a dim lamp. The warm light fell over the piano in the corner of the room. It was scratched, missing a few ivory keys, but it was still beautiful. He brushed his fingers over it gently, whispering, "Hey, old friend." As if it could hear him, Eli sat down, but he didn't play. He stared at a photo frame resting on the piano, a woman smiling, holding a bouquet of lilies. "You'd laugh if you saw me now, huh, Anna?" he murmured. His wife had been his biggest supporter, his inspiration, and his only family. They had traveled together when he was performing across the country. Every performance ended with her in the front row, clapping the loudest. But one night, after a concert in Chicago, the phone rang. There had been a car accident. Anna never made it home after that. Eli had walked off the stage and never returned. He sold everything, packed his trophies in boxes, and found work where no one would know his name. Cleaning halls filled with music allowed him to stay close to what he loved, without ever touching it again. As he sat there now, memories playing in his mind like silent films. A soft knock sounded at the door. He froze, wondering who could be visiting this late. When he opened it, he saw Marla, the night security guard from the symphony, holding a thermos and wearing her usual friendly grin. "Brought you some hot coffee," she said, stepping in without waiting for permission. "You looked like you needed it today." Eli smiled weakly. "You saw that, huh?" "Everyone did," Marla said, setting the thermos down. "That conductor's a piece of work, thinks he's God with a baton." Eli chuckled quietly. "He's just doing his job." "His job doesn't include humiliating good people," she shot back. "You didn't deserve that." He didn't respond. Instead, he poured the coffee and handed her a cup. "Thanks for checking on me." Marla's eyes drifted toward the piano. "You play?" she asked curiously. Eli hesitated. "Used to." "What happened?" He took a deep breath. "Life happened," he said simply. And that was all he could manage. Marla nodded, not pushing further, but as she sipped her coffee, she noticed the walls, the awards, the clippings, the photo of Eli with the President's Medal of Arts. Her eyes widened. "Eli Turner?" she whispered, realizing, "You're that Eli Turner. The pianist from, oh my God," Eli sighed, rubbing his temples. "I was once. But that man's gone." Marla shook her head. "You don't just lose talent like that, you can try to hide it. But it never goes away." He gave a small smile. "You sound like my wife." "Then your wife was right," she replied softly, placing her cup down. "You should play again." "Not for them, for yourself." After she left, Eli sat in silence, her words echoing in his head. He looked back at the piano, his reflection faint in its glossy surface. Slowly, he lifted the lid. The keys gleamed faintly in the lamplight. Calling to him, he sat down, pressed one key, then another. The sound filled the tiny apartment. Soft and haunting, he closed his eyes, and suddenly, he wasn't in his apartment anymore. He was back on stage under the lights, his fingers flying across the keys, the audience silent in awe, Anna smiling from the front row. But when he opened his eyes, he was alone again. The song ended, and the silence that followed felt heavier than ever. He sighed, stood up, and walked to the window, watching the city shimmer somewhere out there. People still believed in music and second chances. But he wasn't one of them, or so he thought. What Eli didn't know was that his quiet performance from the night before wasn't forgotten. Clara, the young violinist, had uploaded the short clip she recorded of him to her social media. The caption read, "The janitor who plays like an angel." By morning, the video would be shared thousands of times. Musicians, critics, and fans across the country would start asking, "Who is this man?" But that night, Eli Turner sat alone by the window, unaware of the storm of fame about to find him again. The piano stood silently behind him, its last note still echoing faintly in the air, as if whispering a secret he hadn't yet heard. Morning sunlight spilled through the dusty blinds of Eli's apartment. He stirred awake to the faint sound of his old radio crackling in the corner. The announcer's voice was cheerful, and now, a mysterious video taking the internet by storm. An unknown janitor playing the piano like a world-class virtuoso. Eli blinked, sitting up slowly, his heart skipping a beat. He turned up the volume, the announcer continued. No one knows who he is, but this clip recorded at Westbrook Symphony Hall has already reached 500,000 views overnight. Some are calling him the ghost pianist. Others say he might be a retired legend hiding in plain sight. Eli froze. His cup of coffee halfway to his lips, he didn't have to guess. He knew exactly whose hands were on that piano. The same calloused fingers that had scrubbed floors for a decade. He sat there for a long moment, feeling both panic and disbelief. Who would do this? How did they even film him? His eyes darted toward his phone, dozens of missed messages lighting up the screen, from old orchestra members, journalists, even his former manager. They all said the same thing. Is this really you? Eli groaned softly, rubbing his face. Lord help me, he muttered, but deep down beneath the fear, there was a flicker of something else, something warm, something that hadn't stirred in years. At the same time, across town, chaos brewed inside the symphony hall. Maestro Alden's face turned red as he slammed his baton on his desk. A janitor? He shouted. They're saying a janitor outplayed my entire orchestra. His assistant stammered. Sir, it's all over social media. Major networks are reaching out. Even the sponsors are talking about bringing him to perform at the gala. The gala? Alden barked. Over my dead body! He paced the room like a storm trapped in a cage. He knew the world's attention was no longer on him, and that wounded his pride deeper than any insult. Meanwhile, Clara sat quietly in the corner of the rehearsal room, guilt twisting her stomach. She hadn't meant for things to explode like this. She just wanted people to know the truth, that the man they laughed at was someone extraordinary. But she hadn't expected millions to agree so quickly. When Eli arrived that evening to start his shift, whispers followed him down the hall. Musicians who once ignored him now turned to stare. Some smiled nervously, others avoided eye contact. He kept his head down, broom in hand, pretending not to notice Mr. Turner. Clara called out softly, hurrying after him. Her eyes were wide with a mix of apology and awe. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean for it to blow up like this. Eli looked at her kindly. You recorded it? She nodded, cheeks flushed. Yes. I just thought people should hear you. You're incredible, Mr. Turner. I didn't want you to stay invisible. He sighed, not angry, just tired. Clara, I've spent years trying to be invisible, but why? She asked quietly. Why hide such a gift? He gave her a small, sad smile. Because some gifts come with ghosts, child. Before Clara could respond, a deep, booming voice interrupted them. Turner! Maestro Alden strode toward them, his polished shoes clicking like gunshots. My office. Now. The tension was thick as Eli followed the conductor upstairs. Inside, Alden slammed the door. Do you realize what you've done? You've humiliated this orchestra. You've made a mockery of me. Eli met his glare calmly. I didn't post anything, sir. Don't play innocent, Alden snapped. You think because people liked a silly video you can waltz back into music? You're a janitor and that's all you'll ever be. Eli said nothing, just stared at the man. His silence unnerved Alden, who sneered and pointed to the door. Stay away from that piano, or you'll be out of a job, understood? Eli nodded slowly, turned and left. His heart felt heavy, but something in him was beginning to change. The humiliation didn't hurt the same way anymore, not after hearing the world's reaction. That night, as he mopped the floor, Marla came by again with her flashlight. You've seen the news, haven't you? She said with a grin. You're famous again. Eli, he chuckled softly. That's not fame. That's trouble, maybe, she replied. But maybe it's also fate. Eli didn't respond, but her words stuck in his mind. Later, when everyone had gone home, he walked onto the stage. The same grand piano stood under a single spotlight waiting. He hesitated, Alden's warning still echoing in his ears. But then he smiled faintly. One more song, he whispered. He sat down. His fingers trembling as they touched the keys, he began to play. Not for the audience. Not for fame, but for Anna, for himself. The melody started soft like a sigh, then grew stronger, filled with hope and sorrow entwined. The hall came alive with the sound unknown to him. A local reporter covering the viral mystery happened to pass by the open doors and stopped. Mesmerized, she lifted her phone and began recording. By morning, the clip of Eli's late-night performance would reach millions more. The headline would read, "The Janitor Who Played the World to Tears." But for now, Eli didn't know any of that. He just played, eyes closed, smiling softly as music once again became his language. His confession, his way back to life the next morning. Westbrook Symphony Hall buzzed like a beehive. The air felt electric, as though something bigger than anyone there could grasp was happening. Every corridor hummed with whispers. Every rehearsal room filled with the same sentence spoken in disbelief. "Have you seen the Janitor video?" By noon, the second clip, the one of Eli's haunting midnight performance, had reached over 5 million views. It wasn't just trending, it had become a phenomenon. Music critics called it raw soul in human form. Some said his music could make a stone cry. Even major news outlets had picked up the story. In the quiet janitor's closet, Eli sat staring at his phone, the screen glowing with messages from around the world. "Come play at Carnegie Hall," one said. "We want to sponsor your performance," said another. Dozens of old faces from his past had resurfaced. Managers, producers, musicians, all suddenly remembering his name. Eli felt dizzy. He wasn't used to this kind of attention anymore. Not after years of being invisible. He slipped the phone into his pocket, took a deep breath, and picked up his mop again. "Back to work," he muttered. But outside, the storm was only growing. Clara burst into the hallway, almost breathless. "Mr. Turner, you're on the news," she exclaimed. "They're calling you the Lost Maestro. They want to interview you." Eli smiled weakly. "Clara, slow down. I'm just trying to do my job." "Your job?" she said, eyes wide. "You're the most talked about pianist in the country right now. Everyone's asking who you are." And Maestro Alden's losing his mind. Before Eli could answer, the hallway door swung open. Alden himself appeared, his face pale but his eyes burning with fury. "Turner, my office now," he hissed, his voice shook. Not with authority, but with fear. In the office, Alden's hands trembled as he slammed a newspaper on the desk. "Look at this," he spat. The headline read, "The Janitor Who Outsparked the Symphony." Underneath was a photo of Eli at the piano, eyes closed, lost in music. "Do you realize the chaos you've caused?" Alden demanded. "The sponsors are calling me, me, asking if we can replace our lead pianist with you." Eli looked calm, almost gentle. "I didn't ask for this, sir." "Don't lie to me," Alden snapped. "You wanted attention, didn't you? You wanted to humiliate me, ruin my career." Eli shook his head. "No, Maestro, I don't want your job. I just wanted to clean the floors." "Then why did you play again?" Alden's voice rose. "Why couldn't you stay where you belong?" Eli didn't respond. He simply met Alden's eyes with a quiet steadiness, a calm that only made the conductor angrier. "You think you're better than me?" Alden hissed, leaning forward. "But you're nothing without that pity the internet gives you," Eli finally spoke, his tone soft. "I don't need pity. I just need peace." That simple sentence struck like lightning. Alden's words died in his throat. He waved his hand sharply toward the door. "Get out!" Eli nodded, turned, and walked out silently, leaving behind the weight of Alden's envy. Outside the office, Marla and Clara were waiting, Clara's eyes full of worry. "What did he say?" Eli smiled faintly. "That I should keep mopping." Marla crossed her arms. "You're too kind, Eli. That man doesn't deserve your respect." Eli shrugged. "He doesn't have to respect me, I just have to respect myself." That night, when he got home, the lights from the city seemed brighter, the streets louder, but inside his apartment, everything was quiet except for the radio. The host's voice echoed softly. "Rumors say the mysterious janitor pianist has been identified as Eli Turner, a former child prodigy who vanished from the stage nearly 20 years ago after the tragic death of his wife." Eli froze, his hands tightening on the edge of the counter. They found out the past he'd buried had finally come back. He switched off the radio and sat down heavily. Staring at the piano across the room, he thought about Anna, about the promise he'd made at her grave, never to perform again. "No music without you," he had whispered back then. But now the world was demanding that he play again, and somewhere deep inside, a small part of him wanted to. The next morning, the symphony hall was packed, not with an audience, but with reporters and news crews, the management. Desperate to control the situation, held a press conference. Maestro Alden stood before the cameras, sweating under the lights. "I assure you," he said stiffly, "Mr. Turner's display was not sanctioned by this institution. He is a valued employee, but he is not part of our musical program." A reporter raised her hand. "But Maestro, he's clearly a trained pianist of world-class skill. Will he be performing at the gala next week?" Alden's jaw tightened. "Absolutely not," he said sharply. Outside the hall, Clara found Eli standing near the steps watching the chaos from a distance. "They're trying to keep you off stage," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "But people are demanding you perform. They're calling for you online." Eli looked at her. "Clara, sometimes the world asks for things it doesn't understand. But they understand you," she said, tears in her eyes. "You gave them something real. Something pure." He smiled softly. "That's kind of you to say. But truth doesn't always need a stage." Just then a black car pulled up, and a man in a suit stepped out. "Mr. Eli Turner?" he asked, handing him a card. "I represent the National Charity Gala Committee. We'd be honored if you'd perform next week." "The whole country will be watching." Clara's mouth fell open. "They want you, not Alden." Eli stared at the card for a long moment. The invitation shimmered under the sunlight, his old life calling him back like a song he thought he'd forgotten. Finally, he said quietly, "Tell them I'll think about it." As the car drove away, Clara smiled through her tears. "You're going to say yes, aren't you?" Eli looked toward the sky, where clouds drifted like sheets of faded music. "Maybe," he whispered. "Maybe it's time the janitor stopped hiding." That night, alone in the hall, he sat at the piano once more. The same melody rose again, but now, it wasn't sorrow, it was courage, it was rebirth. The kind of sound that comes when a broken man begins to believe again, for days. The question haunted Eli Turner. Should he accept the invitation and return to the stage, or stay hidden behind his mop and bucket where the world was safe, silent, and familiar? Everywhere he went, people looked at him differently now. The same musicians who once ignored him now smiled nervously, greeted him by name. Some even apologized for laughing that day. Eli would simply nod and say, "It's all right." But inside he felt the storm brewing. Maestro Alden was growing desperate. His authority was slipping through his fingers like sand. The board was pressuring him to let Eli perform at the gala, the same event he had spent months planning as his moment of glory. "He'll make a fool out of me," Alden muttered to himself, pacing his office. "A janitor stealing my spotlight? Never." He needed a plan, and quickly. Meanwhile, Clara and Marla found Eli backstage late one evening, sitting quietly beside the grand piano, staring at the keys without touching them. The lights were low, the hall empty, yet the air seemed to hold its breath around him. "You haven't given them an answer," Clara said softly, walking closer. "They're waiting." Eli smiled faintly. "That's the problem. Everyone's waiting for something, a miracle. A story, a headline, but music isn't about attention." Marla leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Maybe not. But this isn't just about music anymore, Eli. It's about you showing people what dignity looks like. You were mocked, humiliated, and you still forgave. That means something." Eli's eyes softened. "Forgiveness is easy when you've already lost everything." "No," Clara said firmly. "Forgiveness means you're still strong enough to rise." He chuckled quietly. "You're too young to sound that wise." "Then prove me wrong," she said, a spark of challenge in her voice. "Play again, not for them, not for me, for yourself." Eli turned back to the piano. Fingers hovering over the keys, he played one note, a single, trembling sound that filled the room like a whisper. Then another and another. The melody grew, fragile but alive. Clara watched with tears in her eyes, and Marla smiled knowingly for a moment. It was as if the hall itself came alive again, remembering the man it once called a legend. But in the shadows of the hallway, Maestro Alden stood listening, his jaw tight, his heart burning with jealousy. If he plays at the gala, Alden thought bitterly, I'm finished. The next morning, the symphony's notice board displayed a new announcement. For the upcoming charity gala, a special open segment has been added, The People's Performance, inviting volunteers from the audience to perform live for charity. To the public, it sounded noble, spontaneous fun, but for Alden, it was a perfect trap. If Eli played without preparation, he'd have no time to rehearse, no orchestra, no support, just a janitor fumbling under pressure. The audience would laugh, and Alden's reputation would be safe. When Marla showed Eli the notice, he frowned. "That's not how a gala works. It's a setup," she said bluntly. "He wants you to walk into it blind," Eli nodded slowly. "I know, but maybe it's time to stop running." That evening, Eli sat in his apartment staring at Anna's picture. The world outside buzzed with excitement. News outlets teased the gala's mystery performance. Fans speculated whether the janitor would appear. He sighed, tracing a finger along the frame. "You always said music wasn't about winning, it was about healing," he whispered. "Maybe that's what this is." He spent the night not rehearsing, but remembering. He flipped through his old sheet music, pieces he'd written for Anna, melodies that no one else had ever heard. By dawn, he knew exactly what he would play. The day of the gala arrived. The symphony hall glowed with golden lights and silk banners. Cameramen crowded the aisles. Celebrities filled the front rows. The air was thick with anticipation. Maestro Alden stood on stage in his finest suit. Smiling wide, "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "tonight we celebrate not just music, but the spirit of humanity." His words dripped with false warmth. "And to honor that, we open our stage to anyone brave enough to share their talent with us." The audience murmured, waiting. And then, a quiet figure stepped out from the side curtain. Eli Turner, dressed in his janitor's uniform, his hands slightly trembling. The room went silent. Cameras zoomed in. Flashes lit up like lightning. Alden smirked, whispering to his assistant, "Let's see him humiliate himself." Eli walked slowly to the grand piano. Every step echoing through the hall, he sat down, his old hands brushing over the keys like greeting an old friend. For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Then he began to play. The first notes were gentle, almost shy, but they carried something deep, something that touched the soul. The melody unfolded like a story. Weaving pain and beauty together, each chord spoke of loss, but also of love that never truly died. People leaned forward, unable to look away. The entire hall was still. The music swelled, bursting into a storm of sound, and then softened into a whisper again. By the time the final note hung in the air, not a single person breathed for a long second. Silence ruled the hall, then applause, thunderous, unstoppable, roaring through the building like a wave. Maestro Alden's smile vanished. His face turned pale as he realized what had just happened. Eli stood, bowing slightly, not with pride, but peace. His eyes glistened as he whispered softly to himself, "That was for you, Anna." In that moment, the janitor wasn't just a man who cleaned floors. He was the man who cleaned the dust off the world's heart, reminding everyone what true music felt like. As the audience rose in a standing ovation, Clara wiped her tears, whispering, "He did it." And Marla smiled proudly. "No, child," she said quietly. "He became it." Backstage, Alden stood frozen, the sound of applause echoing through his defeat. He had set the trap, but it was his own arrogance that fell into it. And somewhere in that thunder of clapping hands, Eli Turner smiled, not because he had proved anyone wrong, but because he had finally made peace with himself. The sound of applause still echoed in Eli's ears long after the curtain fell. He stood alone backstage, the glow of the chandeliers fading behind him. For a long moment, he simply breathed, letting the warmth of the audience's standing ovation sink into his bones. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like release. Marla found him first, pushing through the crowd of reporters and performers. Her eyes were shining. "You did it, Eli," she said, almost whispering. "You made the whole world stop to listen." Eli smiled faintly. "I didn't do it for the world, Marla," he said quietly. "I did it for one person." He tapped his chest gently. "For her." She nodded, understanding exactly who he meant. Then Clara appeared, her face flushed with excitement. "They're still cheering out there," she said breathlessly. "You have to come back for an encore." Eli chuckled softly. "Once was enough, child." "But you don't understand," she said. "The broadcast hit over 2 million live viewers. Everyone's talking about you. News anchors are calling it the performance of the decade." He shook his head with a gentle smile. "Let them talk. Music isn't about numbers." Across the stage, Maestro Alden stood frozen, his face pale as marble. The orchestra had gathered behind him, silent, waiting to see what he'd do. His hands trembled. The applause that once belonged to him now belonged to the man he'd mocked. When Eli began walking past, Alden's pride cracked. "You think this makes you special?" He spat suddenly, his voice trembling with fury. You think playing a sad little tune makes you a hero? The nearby musicians fell silent. Eli stopped but didn't turn around. No, maestro, he said softly. It just makes me human. Alden's mouth opened, but no words came out. Eli walked away, each step measured and calm. The applause from the hall still thundered behind him, like a storm that refused to die. That night, Eli didn't go home right away. He walked through the empty streets, the city lights glowing like stars scattered on wet pavement. Reporters called his phone nonstop. Invitations poured in from television stations, record companies, and concert halls, but he ignored them all. He wandered until he reached the small park where he and Anna used to sit after his concerts. The benches were old, the fountain cracked, but it was peaceful. He sat down, the night air cool against his skin. He thought about the years he'd spent hiding, how fear had built a cage around his heart. He'd convinced himself that silence was safety, that anonymity was peace, but now he understood something new. Silence wasn't peace. It was grief pretending to sleep. As dawn painted the sky pale gold, Eli whispered, I kept my promise, Anna. No music without you, but maybe now the music is you. The next morning, Westbrook Symphony Hall was swarmed by journalists. The janitor pianist, as they called him, had become a global symbol of humility and hidden genius. Clips of his performance flooded every platform. Comment sections overflowed with messages like, he played what words can't say, and this is what real art looks like inside the hall. The symphony board met urgently. Sponsors demanded Eli be featured in future concerts. Maestro Alden sat at the end of the table, silent, his hands clenched in his lap. When the chairman spoke, his tone was final. Maestro Alden, your behavior toward Mr. Turner was disgraceful. The board has decided to suspend your directorship until further notice. Alden's face turned white. You can't do that, he shouted. He's a janitor. No, the chairman said coldly. He's the man who saved this orchestra's reputation. As Alden stormed out, his footsteps echoing with bitter defeat, Clara watched from the hallway. She wanted to feel triumphant, but all she felt was relief. Relief that justice, at last, had found its way that afternoon. Eli was cleaning the stage one last time when Clara approached. They want you to take Alden's place for the next concert, she said. Smiling, as guest conductor and pianist, Eli paused, resting on his mop handle. I think I've done enough sweeping for one lifetime, he joked. But Clara could see the hesitation in his eyes, the part of him that still didn't believe he belonged up there. You don't have to prove anything anymore, she said. But maybe, just maybe, the stage isn't something you left behind. Maybe it's been waiting for you. He looked up at the grand piano sitting under the spotlight, silent and gleaming. The same piano that had witnessed both his humiliation and his rebirth. Slowly he nodded. Maybe you're right, he said softly. Maybe I should play one more time. That evening, after everyone left, Eli sat down once again under the empty hall's golden lights. He played not for the audience, not for fame, but for the people who had listened, really listened, the janitors who worked unseen, the widowers who mourned quietly, the dreamers who'd buried their passions under survival. Each note carried a message. You are not forgotten, you are not small. The music rose, filling the vast space, blending sorrow and light. It was no longer about loss, it was about return. The return of a man to his truth. When the final note faded, Eli closed the piano lid gently. That's enough, he whispered. The music belongs to them now. As he stood to leave, he noticed something new on the wall near the exit, a framed plaque that hadn't been there before, in honor of Eli Turner, whose music reminded the world that greatness can wear any uniform. He smiled quietly, his eyes glistening for the first time in years. His heart felt weightless. Outside the city was alive. People walked by humming his melody without knowing its name. Somewhere in that crowd, Eli Turner disappeared again, not as a janitor running from his past, but as a man finally free from it. And as the night breeze swept through the streets, it carried the faintest echo of a piano's final note, whispering softly through the city lights, peace at last. The world didn't move on from Eli Turner as quickly as it usually does with viral sensations. Instead, something strange and beautiful happened. The story refused to fade. Weeks passed since the gala, yet people everywhere still talked about the janitor who played his heart back to life. Schools used his performance in music classes. News anchors still mentioned his name when talking about humility, and even street musicians played his melody in subway stations. But Eli himself had vanished quietly from the spotlight. He hadn't given a single interview, hadn't replied to any invitations, and hadn't returned to Westbrook Symphony Hall since the night he closed the piano lid and whispered goodbye. He was back to his quiet life, living in the same modest apartment with the same worn-out slippers, sweeping the same hallways of his neighborhood cafe to pass time. But something inside him had changed. Not the man people saw, but the man he finally accepted he was every morning. He'd sit by the window with his coffee, looking at the rising sun and hum softly. Sometimes children on their way to school would stop and wave at him. "You're the piano man," they'd say, giggling. He'd smile and wave back. "Not anymore," he'd answer gently, but deep down, the words always made his heart warm. Meanwhile, Westbrook Symphony Hall had turned his story into legend. A permanent plaque now hung on the wall at the main entrance. Beneath it were flowers and handwritten notes from fans. Some said, "You made me believe again," while others read, "Thank you for reminding us that greatness can be quiet." The board had reinstated the music program in his honor, creating the Eli Turner Scholarship for young musicians from humble backgrounds. Clara was the first student accepted into the program. She practiced daily on the same piano Eli had played. Her music filled with both joy and grief. Maestro Alden, on the other hand, had vanished from the public eye after his dismissal. Some said he'd moved abroad. Others claimed he couldn't bear hearing Eli's name anymore. But to Eli, none of that mattered. He bore no anger, only peace one chilly afternoon. Clara showed up at Eli's apartment unannounced, carrying her violin case and a wide smile. "Mr. Turner," she said. "You didn't think I'd forget about you, did you?" Eli laughed. "You tracked me down, didn't you?" "Of course," she said proudly, stepping inside. "I've got news. The symphony wants to dedicate this year's winter concert to you. They want you to come as an honored guest." Eli sighed. "Clara, I told you I'm retired." "Retired?" she said, placing her hands on her hips. "You can't retire from being who you are." He smiled. "You sound more like my conscience than my student." She opened her violin case and began to play, a soft version of the melody he had played that night at the gala. The sound filled the small apartment, warm and tender. Eli felt his throat tighten. He sat down beside her at the piano and quietly joined in. Together they played, mentor and student, old and young, pain and hope intertwined. The music grew richer, deeper, until it felt like the entire room was breathing with them. When the last note faded, Clara said softly, "You should hear the world again, Mr. Turner. You think you're done, but music isn't done with you." Her words lingered long after she left. That night, Eli walked to the park again, the same park where he and Anna used to sit. The fountain was frozen now, the air sharp with winter. He sat on the bench looking up at the stars. "You'd laugh at all this," he murmured to the sky. "Me trending on the internet. Children calling me a hero. What would you say, Anna?" The cold wind brushed his cheek like a soft answer. He smiled. "Yeah, I know, you'd tell me to stop hiding." For the first time in years, he felt a pull, a gentle push from somewhere beyond. The next morning he made a decision. At the winter concert, the hall was packed. Snow glittered outside like confetti. Cameras flashed. Reporters whispered. They all knew Eli Turner had agreed to attend, but no one knew if he'd actually perform. When the event began, Clara performed beautifully, her violin crying and soaring through the hall. The audience gave her a standing ovation. And then the host stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we honor a man who reminded us that music belongs to the heart, not the stage, Mr. Eli Turner." The crowd erupted, applause thundering through the hall. Eli walked onto the stage slowly, dressed simply just as he always was. He smiled at Clara, then turned to the audience. "I didn't come here to perform," he began, his voice steady but soft. "I came to listen, but maybe just one song." The hall went silent. He sat at the piano, hands trembling slightly, the lights dimmed, a single spotlight shining down on him. He began to play, not the same song as before, but something new, something that sounded like hope finding its way through grief. The notes were delicate yet full of life, like morning sunlight breaking through frost. Tears streamed down faces in the audience. Even the orchestra members had gone still. His music seemed to tell every person there, "You've been hurt, but you're still here." When he finished, the applause was softer this time. Not thunderous, but reverent like a prayer. Eli stood, bowed once, and whispered, "Thank you for listening," as he walked off the stage. Clara hugged him tightly, whispering, "She'd be proud of you." Eli smiled, eyes shining. She already is. Outside, snow was falling gently over the city. Covering everything in white, Eli looked up, the cold air biting his cheeks, and whispered, "It's time to go home." And somewhere far away in the music carried by the wind, it felt as if Anna was whispering back, "Welcome home." The snow fell thick and soft over Westbrook that night, blanketing the streets in a quiet glow. The winter concert had ended hours ago. Yet the echoes of Eli Turner's final performance lingered in the air like the scent of candle smoke after a prayer. People walked out of the hall still in silence, holding their coats tighter, speaking only in whispers, as if afraid that words might break the fragile spell his music had left behind. Eli walked slowly through the falling snow, his breath misting in front of him. Each step crunched softly beneath his shoes. He had no car, no driver waiting, just the same long road back to his little apartment on the edge of town. And somehow that felt perfect. He passed shop windows glowing with Christmas lights, families laughing inside cafes, strangers smiling over hot chocolate. Every now and then someone would recognize him. "It's him," they'd whisper. But he only smiled, nodded politely, and kept walking. He wasn't the man from the videos anymore, not the janitor, not the pianist, not even the lost maestro. He was simply Eli Turner, a man who had finally found peace where once there had only been silence. When he reached his apartment, he took off his coat, lit the small lamp by the window, and sat at the piano. The keys were cold beneath his fingers. The world outside glowed silver. He didn't play a song this time. He just pressed one soft note and let it linger. A single sound for a lifetime of music. Then he smiled, whispering, "We did it, Anna." A week passed, then two. The newspapers printed his photo again, calling him the man who changed music without saying a word. Donations poured into the scholarship fund bearing his name. Young musicians wrote letters saying his story had saved their dreams. Clara became the heart of the new symphony generation. Her performances inspired by Eli's message of honesty and emotion. "Music isn't perfection," she would say, quoting him. "It's truth you can hear." The board offered Eli a permanent position as mentor and advisor, but he politely declined. "My time is finished," he told them gently. "Let the new ones play their stories now." Still, he visited the hall once a week, usually in the early mornings when it was empty. He would sweep the floor out of habit, though no one asked him to. Then he'd sit at the piano, close his eyes, and listen, not to his own hands, but to the ghosts of sound that lived in the air. Clara's laughter during practice, Marla's teasing remarks, the echo of applause, and somewhere, always, the memory of Anna's gentle voice saying, "Keep going." One morning, Marla found him there, a thermos of coffee in her hand as always. "You'll never stop coming here, will you?" she said with a grin. Eli chuckled. "Old habits die harder than people think." She handed him the cup and leaned on the piano. "You know, you've done more than any famous musician I've seen, Eli. You didn't just play music, you reminded people what it means." He smiled at that. "Maybe," he said softly. "But I think I just reminded myself." They sat together in silence for a while, the winter light spilling across the empty stage. It felt like the world had slowed down just for them. Later that day, Clara arrived for her rehearsal. When she saw Eli, she ran to hug him. "Guess what?" she said excitedly. "They've invited the symphony to play in Paris, and they want to dedicate the first piece to you." Eli laughed warmly. "Paris, huh? That's quite a long way for a janitor." "You're not a janitor anymore," she said with a mock stern look. "You're a legend." He shook his head gently. "No, Clara, legends are stories. I'm just a man who found his song again, that night." Clara performed his melody during rehearsal, the same one that had once healed him. Only this time it wasn't heavy with sorrow. It soared, full of joy and youth and new beginnings. Eli sat in the back row listening quietly. The notes filled the hall brighter than ever before. He closed his eyes, and in that moment, he could almost feel Anna's hand on his shoulder. After the rehearsal ended, Eli lingered for a while, watching the lights dim. The stage was empty again, just as it had been that first night when he dared to sit at the piano after everyone left. He walked up to it, ran his fingers along the polished edge, and smiled. "This place doesn't belong to me anymore," he whispered. It belongs to them. He placed a small envelope on the piano bench. Inside was his handwritten sheet music, titled, "For Anna, the Last Song." Clara would find it the next morning, and it would become the symphony's most beloved composition, played every year at the winter concert as a tribute to love. Resilience and quiet greatness. Eli walked out into the snowy night once more. The wind was gentle, the world hushed. He looked up at the stars, the flakes landing softly in his hair. "I'm ready now," he whispered. "I've said everything I needed to say." The next morning, when Marla came to the hall, she found the piano lid closed and the bench empty. The lights were off, the air still, but when she sat down and pressed one key, a faint note rang out, clear, pure, full of peace. News of Eli Turner's passing spread quietly, not with noise but with music. Radio stations across the country played his melody in remembrance, and people everywhere stopped for a moment to listen. At his memorial concert, Clara stood on stage, tears glistening in her eyes, and said, "He was a janitor, a pianist, a teacher, but above all he was a reminder that no matter where life places you, your music can still reach the world." As the orchestra played his final piece, snow began to fall outside again, soft and steady, just like the night he'd first played in an empty hall. And somewhere, far beyond the applause and the lights, a man named Eli Turner smiled quietly, free at last, his melody now eternal, carried forever in every heart that had once stopped to listen.